If y'all want to, we'll go ahead and get started tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming. Appreciate you being here. And like I said, this is our second meeting. We'll have another one in 2 weeks. Is that right, Nathan?
Yes, sir.
So what we're going to do, there's a place to sign in back there if you don't care to sign in. And if you have a question when Nathan gets ready to take questions, just tell us who you are so we'll know, you can identify yourselves. But this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Nathan. And Nathan, you just come talk to us and tell us your plans. And I'm just going to be a listener myself, and I may have a question also. But I'll turn it over to you. You can use this mic, or you can talk without it, whatever you want to do.
I've been hollering at people all day, so I'm just going to hold the mic here. Again, thank you for coming out. This is the second of 3 workshops that we plan to have that deal with the zoning ordinance for the city of Hamilton. I'm Nathan Willingham. I'm the Planning and Transportation Director at the Northwest Alabama Council of Local Governments. I oversee 3 basic programs in my agency: transportation planning, public transit, and also regional and community planning. We help a lot of communities around our 5-county region: Colbert, Lauderdale, Franklin, Marion, and Winston counties, to think through issues that are related to growth and development and to related to the tools that cities have available to them to kind of guide those activities into the future. Again, like I said, this is the second workshop. I'd like to start out, for those who weren't with us previously, with a very brief review of what we covered in the first workshop, including the origins and purpose of the zoning ordinance, some of the issues that were identified as part of that first workshop, and then briefly pause and see if there's any additional concerns that have come to the surface in a couple of weeks since we last met. And then I'd like to move on to present what I think is a pretty good summary of the recommendations that we intend to make to the Planning Commission. I'll preface it at the beginning and throw out the presentation by saying that these are just our recommendations that are based on public comments over the past 3 to 4 years, conversations with elected officials, as well as the public workshop that we had previously. We've done a lot of, at the previous meeting, we talked about the 19 or so rezoning requests that we've reviewed in the past 3 to 4 years, the probably 40 or so planning commission meetings and city council meetings that we've had that have involved issues related to planning and zoning. There's been a lot of formal conversations that have taken place at official planning commission meetings and at city council meetings, but there's also been a whole lot of informal conversations. And what we wanted to do in this series of workshops was to give the public and those who are concerned with these issues an opportunity to ask questions directly, to hear the responses, so that we could communicate as clearly as possible about what the purpose of the zoning ordinance was, about what we're trying to accomplish, about some of the open, honest things that have been problematic for us in the past, and about some of the recommendations we might have going forward. From these recommendations, these are just a consultant's ideas that are based on their history of working with the city of Hamilton. From that, we'll present these to the Planning Commission, who will finalize them as a formal set of recommendations to the City Council, which is, as we will talk about again in just a minute, the body that formally establishes the rules that are related to zoning activities inside the city. So essentially those recommendations fall into 2 main categories. One is what are the rules and the boundaries for the zoning districts that should apply, in our opinion, to the city of Hamilton. And then second, what are the rules for non-conforming uses in general, and specifically those non-conforming uses that happen to be manufactured houses. We talked about the last meeting. Zoning is basically a police power. It's intended to promote public health, safety, and welfare by distinguishing districts for different uses and different structural requirements for buildings within those areas. State enabling legislation, Title 11, Subtitle 2, Chapter 52, 11-52, just allows for a zoning ordinance. It's not a rule, it's not a regulation that cities have to have, it's not a requirement of cities. But most cities that think in terms of the future have come to the conclusion that they need some sort of regulatory authority to establish or affix patterns of land use that are desirable today and to encourage things that are desirable in the future. The police power generally applies in those areas where an individual's use of their land can affect others. And that can be things like traffic generation, traffic congestion, impacts on public infrastructure, noxious fumes and odors, the placements of agricultural uses, industrial uses, and so forth. Usually zoning is part of a larger system of planning and thinking about the future. It is only one of several tools that are available to cities to guide growth and development going forward. It's basically, by definition, the division of a city, of its territory, jurisdiction, into districts, and within those districts, setting rules for what can go into them, the use or activity on the land, and then the basic design features of how those uses interact with public infrastructure and with each other. And all of that, again, is just to promote more orderly growth and development and to promote a better general welfare for the residents of the city. American zoning evolved in a time when growth and development didn't take a whole lot of consideration of sanitation and health concerns. Buildings were often too high for fire protection, for police services, and for fire protective services to reach. They weren't designed with the adjacent infrastructure in mind. Oftentimes, sometimes they were too close together, or they didn't provide for adequate ventilation, so that when sickness came into a building, it quickly permeated the entire building, caused many, many problems. We talked a bit last time about the evolution of zoning. I'll only hit a couple of the high points here. Zoning really started out in the early, late 18th, early 19th century. The late 19th, early 20th centuries. At a time when U.S. cities were really starting to boom as the Industrial Revolution took place and as urbanization began to increase pace. In the early 20s, the U.S. Department of Commerce produced a standard zoning enabling legislation, which it presented to states to adopt as their state enabling legislation to sort of set the framework for planning and zoning activities. And as we have a tradition of doing in the United States, someone was sued over it because they felt that it infringed upon their rights and liberties, which again, of course, that's anyone's right to do. But in the Village of Euclid v. Amber Realty in 1926, the Supreme Court set aside the question of whether a city could divide its territory into districts for land use, whether it had the basic authority to divide up a city into zones and to impose design standards and use standards within those zones. And this piece of case law came down from the Supreme Court of the United States that said, yes, cities can do this. And quite honestly, we've been arguing in court about what the extent of that power has been ever since. Many times cities have overstepped their boundaries, and many times their decisions have been upheld. In general, however, since 1923, when the state of Alabama adopted the enabling legislation for planning and zoning, cities have possessed a very wide grant of authority in what they can do to enforce their zoning ordinance and in the purposes that they can use for zoning. And then finally, 1975 gives us the most recent update to the enabling legislation for zoning in the state of Alabama. It's got some rust on it, some dust on it, some things that are outdated, but it is the legislation that we have, and it does set the parameters for current zoning practice in the state. So in a nutshell, what is zoning? It's the division of a territory to govern the use or the activities that take place on the land and the design or the look and function of a place. This is drawn directly from the Alabama Code section 1152-73. I've added the emphasis here, but it basically illustrates what the grant of zoning authority does for a city. It allows the city to regulate the height and size of building structures, percentage of land that may be occupied, the size of yards and open spaces, and the density of population. All of that has to do with density, size, structural requirements. So if I say a dimensional or a structural requirement of the zoning ordinance, I'm referring back to this grant of authority. And then finally, and the location and use of buildings and land. If I say land use or activity, again, I'm referring back to this portion of the enabling legislation. The process of zoning contains various officials at the city level. A zoning compliance officer is usually the administrative official who is in charge of being the first point of contact at the city level, understanding the rules and regulations, handling the permitting process, processing requests for various activities that are related to zoning, and in general just being the official that's in charge of making administrative decisions on behalf of the city related to zoning. Planning Commission serves as an advisory board that makes recommendations about what the rules and the boundaries should be in a zoning ordinance. They recommend to the City Council that certain rules be put in place within certain districts and that certain district boundaries be drawn in certain ways that make sense. The Planning Commission then serves as an advisory board. It's an appointed board. It's meant to be citizen planners that represent the people and serve at the behest of the mayor and the council to try to facilitate a comprehensive planning process that has some points of feedback from the public in it. Zoning Board of Adjustments has three basic powers. They can hear administrative appeals if it's thought that an administrative official made a decision in error. They can decide special exceptions or uses that are permitted on appeal, conditional uses they're often called. These are items that are specifically spelled out in the zoning ordinance that are allowed if the Zoning Board of Adjustments allows them, and oftentimes they will place restrictions on how those activities develop or how those buildings or structures or uses actually come out of the ground into being, so that they can minimize the amount of impact that those new facilities have on adjacent property owners and on the community at large. And then finally, the Zoning Board of Adjustments has the authority to grant variances in narrow cases where the rules, the regulations that are in place would not allow somebody to gain any use of their property. We often call it denying the property owner economic use of their property. It doesn't mean that the zoning board has to grant every variance that's requested of it, but it does have to consider the placement of that piece of property in relation to the regulations and in relation to other parcels of property, and determine what's best for the city in granting those variances. And then finally, the city council has the ultimate role of adopting and amending the ordinance and the map boundaries. They set the rules and they set the district boundaries in which those rules will be enforced. Very common concerns. These are not necessarily specific to the city of Hamilton. Of course, property rights, we mentioned earlier, are a big issue. To deny someone the use of their property is frankly not legal, constitutional, nor right, and it's not something that any city should strive to do. The city of Hamilton naturally does not. Excluding a particular land use entirely from a jurisdiction is something that should only be done in very narrow circumstances where that land use has the potential to have a highly negative effect across the jurisdiction. The land use that is excluded can't be available as part of someone's constitutional rights to free speech and expression, but it has to be something that is so noxious that in general you just don't want it around. The courts have said that it's bad enough that you can keep them outside the city limits because there's plenty of opportunity outside the city limits for things such as poultry houses and pig farms and other things that might have noxious effect. The complications that are involved in zoning ordinance are something we always hear a lot about. Bureaucratic red tape is something that citizens often and always complain about. And one of the things that we've tried to do in this zoning ordinance update is to cut down on some of that. Of course, we're not going to be able to eliminate all of it. And a lot of the complications can be assuaged or set aside by having competent folks that are available to you to help explain the rules of the ordinance. That's why having a good zoning compliance officer at the local level is important. Or while you're building up a good capacity to enforce your ordinance, having an outside consultant such as NACOG and our planning staff to help you along the way can be helpful to you. And then finally, you don't want a zoning ordinance that makes every set of housing developments look exactly the same throughout the city. It leads to less value, less choice. You don't want all of your housing types to be of one type or another because not every family or every individual that's looking at purchasing or renting a parcel of property to live in, to work in, to set up a business is looking for exactly the same thing. And then finally, you absolutely want for your zoning ordinance to reflect the needs and the desires, the present needs and the future desires of the city that the zoning ordinance is intended for. In this case, of course, we want for this ordinance, when we're finished with this update, to reflect the things that we've heard from the residents of Hamilton over the years. And although we're not going to be able to make everyone happy, and we're not going to be able to address every concern in every circumstances with an ordinance or any ordinance or any map, what we can do is listen and give a genuine effort to balance out ideas and to reach some consensus that makes not everyone happy, but makes everyone aware of what their rights and protections are and aware of how the ordinance is working for them, even if there are areas that they may not necessarily agree with. Specifically, at our last meeting, we talked about unused provisions in the zoning ordinance. These are areas that are either duplicative or not enforced, or they're zones that are named in the ordinance that have not been incorporated into the map. They're basically things in the ordinance that aren't being enforced right now. They're not being used. And with an ordinance that's several years old, it's important for us to take a look at those provisions and see why they're not being used. Much of it's due to administrative capacity and demand, and to see what we can do to either improve administrative capacity and demand, or to simplify the ordinance, remove some of those complications by taking out these unnecessary elements. At some point in the future, they may become necessary. At some point in the future, the city may decide that signage is a problem or is potentially a problem, that landscaping is desirable. But until those things really come to a head and the residents begin to put pressure on their elected officials or their planning commissioners to make the community look or feel a certain way through those particular zoning requirements, then there's not a whole lot of need to have them in zoning. Another area that was identified in the ordinance review and through the comments that we've received over the years is the lack of an agricultural zoning district. Currently in the city of Hamilton, which is a very rural city, you can't have certain agricultural uses. There aren't provisions for gardening, there aren't provisions for small-scale livestock and things of that nature, greenhouses and so forth. So we tried to address that as well. And then, as we mentioned before, non-conforming uses in general and manufactured housing uses, and the rules and regulations that discuss how an individual or property owner can continue to use the property and get the maximum benefit or value out of it while undertaking a long-term strategy that fits the city, that improves the environment that's around. Where are manufactured homes appropriate, and then how to deal with them if they're in an area that is not, in the long term, an appropriate area. How to manage those transitions through good growth and development policy. So when we left the last meeting, we had basically 3 next steps that we've attempted to come into or to encounter or to resolve. We wanted to identify and inventory non-conforming uses by reference to, over here, the existing land use map, and then beside it, the current zoning ordinance, zoning district boundaries. We're going to review the text of the zoning ordinance and identify the provisions that needed to have some effort given to them, some recommendations made to address those issues that we just identified. And then we also want to be able to present a draft of those recommendations. Of course, we can't present 45 pages of text on a slide. We could, nobody would stick around for it. But we can give you a high-level overview of what's in the ordinance, so that if you have a question about it, you can ask. Or if you really want to dig down and do the research, you can find a copy of the draft when we get it out and available, and read it for yourself. And then, of course, with that, we also want to show how those districts might look on a proposed zoning map. So the next run-through, the next stage, when we go into this second section of what we're talking about this evening, I want to try to cover it pretty quickly so that we leave plenty of time for questions as a group, if anybody has anything they want to ask, as well as plenty of time to come up and individually talk about what we've got up here on the zoning map, on the proposed recommended zoning map. So in our analysis, where we compared the existing land use, which is this multicolored map over here with a lot of green, to the existing zoning districts, the stuff that's being enforced today, what we try to do is just go through and look at places where we had non-conforming. There's stuff that just did not fit in the current zoning. We evaluated the types of uses that were non-conforming and the locations, the zoning districts, and generally the geography of where those areas were located within the city. And quite honestly, the area that had the greatest degree of non-conformity was in the outlying areas, which are a lighter yellow color on the zoning map over here. Those are areas that are, with reference to the existing land use, they're more outlying in scope. They're not as tightly concentrated or densely developed as more inner areas. Frankly, they're more rural areas of the city of Hamilton. So the majority of our nonconformity was tied in with the R1 district, and the majority of the development type that we were dealing with when we looked at a map that overlaid the district boundaries with the existing land use had to do with agricultural and manufactured housing uses. Again, that's not a surprise at all to anyone who was here last time or who has been party to the discussions that have been had through the years, with folks just coming up and asking, I'm thinking about this, what can I do? What do I need to do to be able to do this thing over here? And then another thing that we tried to do was to take the existing land use map outside of the existing district boundaries, outside of those boundaries, but to identify neighborhoods. And when I say neighborhoods, I don't even mean multi-parcel developments. I mean that also, but I mean multiple areas that are multiple parcels that are developed in generally the same character, or that exist in accordance with what is desired for the future. A single business located on the highway with good access to a major thoroughfare with adequate setbacks, with adequate lighting and signage and parking and so forth, is not necessarily a neighborhood, but we got to have a term for it. We got to have something to call it. So we grouped it in here in this neighborhood analysis because it's something that is a condition that's not problematical and needs to be preserved going forward, and our zoning ordinance needs to do that. But in addition, what we try to do is identify clusters or groups, neighborhoods as we traditionally know them, groups of parcels that have very similar design features that are all compatible, that kind of hang together and can easily be seen in a visual sense, in what we call oftentimes the sense of place when you're there. You can identify them as a neighborhood. Examples include single-family developments. We talked a little bit about commercial developments, mixed housing neighborhoods, and also manufactured homes. So what we've done in the next few slides is I'm going to try to show you up here on the screen a blow-up of the areas that are in question and then make reference to them over here at the existing land use map. And if you have any questions about that specifically, again, we'll have time for that later on, or you can come up and talk to me later. So when we talk about a single-family neighborhood, this is an interesting parcel. There was some discussion of this area. Is it Oak Hill subdivision? Is that it? In this area here? I think that's it. There's some discussion of the last meeting with regard to restrictive covenants, what the appropriate zoning would be, what the appropriate zoning should be, and so forth. On this map here, I don't know if you can see it very well, especially from the back, but again, if you have any questions, we can run that through. The darker colored parcels are areas that are already developed. They are individual homes, and the yellow designates that they are single-family residences. A caveat to this is, of course, although we did go house to house, street to street, there could have been some parcels that we missed that were of a different development pattern. But by and large, what you can see is that this neighborhood, and forgive me if I point to a parcel that's identifiable to any individual, but this neighborhood is by and large, where it's developed, the darker yellow parcels are single-family in character. The lighter yellow parcels are largely the ones that we could identify that are divided up into individual lots, and they're somewhat clear and urban in nature. They're ready for development. They're sitting there and they're ready to receive a certain development type. So the question we have to ask ourselves in a case like this is, what would we recommend that this area be zoned? How should it be zoned? What should the character of this area be going forward? You can't see it very easily, but there's one parcel there and one here that are brown in color on the existing land use map, and that represents a manufactured home on a single family. A manufactured home on a single individual lot. So what we've got is a whole lot of roughly half to 75% that's developed as single family homes, individual lots. We've got 2 out of that development that are manufactured homes. We've got a lot that's not forested, it's relatively clear, and we assume that it has adequate utilities because there are streets there, there are existing houses and so forth there. The question we have to ask, and frankly the Planning Commission has to make a recommendation on, the council has to ultimately answer, is what is this intended for in the future? What's going on there? What's the intent of it? Aside from the fact that we believe that there are restrictive covenants in place that govern the development of this subdivision that says that parcels that go on this land need to be single family in nature. Aside from that, what does the zoning potentially say about it? I forgot, the green areas are divided off into parcels, but they're not necessarily clear. They're either currently being used as agriculture or forest. So we've got a mix of forested area that's not immediately available, would not necessarily be immediately available for development. You have to do some clearing, rubbing, you have to get it ready, site ready for a new structure, whatever the structure was. We've got an existing development pattern that's largely single family, and then we've got a number of lots that are cleared, they're subdivided, they're ready to receive whatever structure will be built on there. Well, in a typical zoning recommendation, which is the recommendation that we ultimately show on this map here, in a typical zoning recommendation, we would recommend that that be classified as a single-family neighborhood, as a single-family district, as a single-family zone on the zoning map, and to be protected by the rules that govern new development on that site, redevelopment in that neighborhood, such that it continues to be, or it grows going forward as single-family residences. And that's actually from the hearsay, at least, and a couple of the references that I've seen to, let's back off of that comment and say, the one reference that I've been presented to a deed in that area, that's what was intended when the property was divided, and so there are restricted covenants in place, and there are currently private property protections between individuals. But those protections between individuals aren't always enforced because somebody has to be willing to step forward and actually take their neighbor into court to be able to enforce those. Versus the city, which has zoning authority, which would be able to hopefully gently let an owner know before they invest too much in that parcel that what they intend to do, that they can't build a manufacturing plant right in the middle of it. That's an extreme example, but they also can't pull a manufactured home into that neighborhood because it is zoned that way, because it is intended in the future to develop in a certain pattern. Again, another example, there's much more mixed use in this neighborhood, and the question becomes, what do we do with this? How do we govern it? Over here, I know you can't see it from there, that's a multiple family, it's either a duplex or an apartment complex. There's a little bit of business on this side of the street, manufactured housing, predominantly single family. But what should the protections for that neighborhood, or the lack of protections for that neighborhood be? Again, we're going to try to make some recommendations about those, but this is just an illustration of some of the thinking that we put into this process as we move forward. This is an easily identifiable commercial development, one that a lot of folks in Hamilton have taken a whole lot of pride in over the years and have made a significant recent investment in, ongoing recent investment if you try to get downtown nowadays. But this is the heart of downtown. That's the courthouse. That's the court square right there. And on either side of it are the shops that were the first commercial activities in that governmental, civic, institutional area inside the town. There's a lot of history and a lot of character there. And for planning processes, the city has come together and the planning commission's produced a plan the council has endorsed for redeveloping these areas. So one of the questions that we would be remiss not to ask, considering the amount of effort and importance that this area has culturally to the city, is what do we do to preserve that, to promote that? If a block here was removed through fire or other activity that just demolished that entire block, what would be done to ensure, if anything, that it came back in a way that preserved what folks think of when they think of downtown Hamilton, rather than in a way that they think of when they think of the typical fast food restaurant? I won't pick on anyone in particular, but much of the planning that's gone on in downtown Hamilton, despite the importance of commerce, and despite the need to have appropriate locations for commerce elsewhere in town, much of the planning for downtown Hamilton that's been discussed has been design-based. What does downtown traditionally look like? How are the buildings structured? How wide are the frontages? What's the spacing on the windows usually look like? How close are they to the sidewalks, and what kind of materials are typically used? Now, we haven't got all those tools in place to govern or to regulate how downtown looks and feels, but one of the things that we can use to guide that is the zoning ordinance, which can say that certain types of uses are not appropriate for downtown, certain types of commercial uses are certainly not appropriate for downtown over a certain square footage, or those that require tremendous amounts of parking, and so forth, because those are features of a commercial use that it may be the most desirable commercial use in the community. It may be the type of store that's the most desirable, but it may not be appropriate for downtown. And there may be an area that is planned for and designed with infrastructure to receive that in a way that redirects it from an area that's culturally and historically significant to the residents into an area that's more appropriate for that type of development. It's a good example here of a mixed housing type development. Again, using the same patterns we talked, same land use coding, color coding that we talked about earlier. We've got some yellow in here that's single family houses. Blue is institutions, probably a church, probably another one here. I'm guessing, I haven't been out there and I haven't looked at the parcel data individually, but largely, you know, when you get into these areas, it's churches. Then a good bit of brown, which is the manufactured home color classification. This is an example of an area where, if one takes into consideration all the comments that we've heard, this is probably not an area that is going to suffer if manufactured housing comes in over time, as long as that manufactured housing is an improvement on the quality of structural conditions and appearance and design that's in place right there, right now. So this is a good example of an area that would be a mixed housing type residential, where you might have a mix of single-family structural types, a site-built house next to a double-wide manufactured home, next to a single-wide manufactured home. And as long as each of those maintains a minimum standard for development, for health and safety and appearance and design, and all those things that are appropriate for the city of Hamilton, they can progress. It's the opposite of regress, fall back, the opposite of fall back. They can go forward into a pattern that actually uplifts the standard for development inside of the city without being overly restrictive, or without saying no too many times, or without making folks feel as if they're unwanted or undesired in the community. And so we've tried to take that and those comments and these traditional development patterns as they exist and identify places where they exist, and this is important, so that an individual who wants to use their property for a manufactured home inside these areas can do so by right without having to go to anybody except for the zoning compliance officer and the building inspector, and of course their installer, and make sure that it's installed correctly. But they don't have to go to the city council to get it rezoned. They have a right to use their property to that because it's the right way for that property to develop, and it's because it's the right thing for the city of Hamilton to protect the development rights of those individuals. On the other hand, these folks here who own these parcels, who do not want to see them redeveloped into something other than single family, they also have the right, and this is different than it's been. In the past, it's been people were restricted in these areas, and they had to ask permission. So we're turning this coin over in our recommendations, and we're making it so that these individuals have the right to request the protection of a single-family zoning district for their parcels in their area if they wish to have those protections put on them. And that's much different than it has been in the past. In addition, as you'll see in some of my comments later, in addition, we're making it the standard in Hamilton, in our recommendations, I should say, we are recommending that it become the standard for Hamilton, that essentially, if it is an improvement of the existing conditions of the property, that the owner be permitted to do it. And there are some certain standards that are involved in that. We can talk a little bit about that, and I'll answer any questions about that. But in the past, the standard has been, no, you can't do this. If the parcel is not conforming, then it has to pretty much fall down around an owner's ears before it's torn down and then rebuilt in a manner that improves the community. What we're trying to accomplish is a reasonable accommodation to that, so that if someone wants to improve their property, they can. Because improving their property today in a shorter time horizon is seen, has been communicated to us at least, as a thing that is beneficial to the city of Hamilton, as a point of conflict and contention that has existed needlessly and that we can potentially remove as part of the settlement of that. And then finally, a final example is this parcel here, which is primarily manufactured housing that exists more than 1 2-acre lot. So there may be homes lined up, and then 2 or 3, and then 2, and so forth. And this would be a good candidate to be designated as an existing manufactured home park. It would be a good area, in our opinion, to place the manufactured home designation on it so that it's protected, but so that new improvements have to meet certain standards with regard to size and design and so forth. So our recommendations. Again, recommendations that we've made have fallen into 2 categories. One has to do with the zoning districts that exist in the city. Excuse me. And then the other has to do with general non-conforming uses, and then how we address non-conformity with respect to manufactured homes. The old zoning ordinance, we recommend that you restructure it considerably. We recommend that you reduce the number of residential districts and consolidate them into 3, an ag and rural district, a single-family district, and a multiple-family district that would include both duplexes and multiple-family residences, apartments and duplexes, as well as single-family houses. The ultimate the highest level of choice is in the R3 district because you can choose to build a single-family home, a duplex, or a multiple-family structure in that area. It's the least restricted. We're not recommending manufactured homes in there because mostly those areas that would be appropriate for R3 are already pretty well built out with either apartments, duplexes, or single-family homes. And we can illustrate that on the zoning map here in a little bit. Single-family would be the traditional single-family residential district. That would be virtually the only thing that was allowed in there other than what we call home occupations, which are minimally invasive activities that somebody can use to earn a living, to be productive, and so forth. And then finally, going backwards through this, we'll go forward through them again. The R1 is an ag and rural district that allows for agricultural uses that were previously excluded from the zoning ordinance, allows for single-family housing and for a development pattern that is accommodating to rural residential, which includes single-family or single lots with manufactured homes. Not mobile home parks, not manufactured home housing parks, but mobile homes on individual lots. And we're recommending that a large area be opened up to those to accommodate what is desired, has been desired in the past in Hamilton. So the R1 Ag and Rural District replaces the existing R1, which is a restrictive. It's a single-family district. That's all you can do there. It also does not allow for agricultural uses or for home occupations. We feel like it's an oversight in an area that's not densely developed to tell folks that you can't do certain minimally invasive home occupations. Again, the biggest change is probably that it allows for manufactured housing by right. Go to City Hall, check the zoning map, make sure your permit's in order, build. If it is a single-family home, an agricultural use, or a manufactured home that fits within the ordinance, that meets certain criteria, decide what you want to do, go to City Hall, get a permit, build. Cuts out a lot of the administrative oversight and a lot of the restrictions that were in place before. And we're recommending, as you'll see in a minute, that a whole lot of area be opened up to that because it does not affect existing development significantly and does not affect the commercial and industrial opportunities, economic development opportunities of the city of Hamilton going forward. Again, the R2 single-family district then becomes the single-family residential district for the city of Hamilton. Densely developed single-family areas should be designated as R2. Those places where an owner wants to preserve a tract of land for the future to develop as a dense single-family subdivision, that owner can request that that tract be rezoned to R2. And then they can market that tract as an R2 residential subdivision district to a potential developer. They can develop it themselves. They can divide that type of lots out and go into the real estate development market if they so choose, without having to worry about somebody being able to purchase one of those lots and then move a development type that's not within the character of what they envision for that future development into that parcel or into that new development. It offers those zoning protections. It offers them in areas that are predominantly single-family today and that future development types choose to or are planned to be single-family in the future. The R3 district remains pretty much unchanged. It allows for single-family duplex, single-family residences, duplexes, and apartment complexes. It's very much the same as the previous R3. And then finally, the district that accommodates manufactured housing parks has not changed much. These are places where manufactured homes are desired to be located on more than one home on a single lot. There are design guidelines that guide that so that there are minimum standards for the city. The business district, the main thing that we did was to eliminate the neighborhood business and professional districts. If you walk through a business district in Hamilton, you're probably, by and large, going to be able to identify two. One of them is a general business district, which is more auto-oriented, has deeper setbacks, and has a lot more parking because it's more designed to accommodate automobiles. And then the other is, of course, the central business district, which we talked a bit about. It's your downtown district. It's got that downtown look and that downtown feel to it. Since the neighborhood business district really didn't differ that much from the general business district, we decided to consolidate them or recommend their consolidation And since the professional district had not really received a lot of use, because you could open professional offices within any of the other two, either of the other two districts, there wasn't a lot of use for it, so we recommend that it be removed, that those regulations be eliminated from the ordinance, so they don't take up space, you don't have to run costs, you don't have to figure out what they mean in order to be prepared to accommodate that kind of development. And then industrial districts are entirely unchanged. The M1 accommodates the light industry, which we by and large describe as non-smokestack, and then M2 is heavier industries that have potentially have more truck traffic and more vibrations, and not so much smokestacks today, but also potentially have some smokestacks. In the ordinance, the things that we primarily deleted are things that we talked about earlier that dealt with landscaping and signage, floodplains, which there are still floodplains. FEMA still issues flood maps, banks still require flood insurance. The city and its residents are still eligible for flood insurance because those regulations are part of a separate flood ordinance that was drafted by your engineer and was adopted by the city several years ago. And then finally, airport zoning is something that never found its way onto the map. It, again, wasn't being used. It may be a great thing to have to protect residents and to protect, especially considering recent events in Birmingham and so forth. It may be a wonderful thing to have, but it's not something that has been a hot topic issue for the city, and it's not something that ever actually found its way onto a map in a way that was even enforceable to the city. I won't belabor the language of non-conforming use too much. I will just try to summarize it by saying that we talk a lot about uses, which are activities, and structures, which have to abide by setbacks and dimensional requirements, placement of structures, their height, how close they are to the right-of-way, how far they are to the rear lot line, things of that nature. So when we talk about structure, we're talking about what's going on. And when we talk about, when we talk about use, we're talking about what's going on, the things that are taking place, the activities on the land. And we talk about structure, we're talking about the placement of a building. Dimensional requirements, structural and dimensional requirements. So in the old ordinance, if you abandoned the use for 12 months and it was non-conforming, meaning the stuff that you were doing on that property was not something that was allowed as an activity in that zoning district. If you left it for 12 months, the city said that you could not come back in under your rights as a grandfathered use. And a year is a pretty long time. Additionally, if a structure contained a non-conforming use and it burned, you were not able to reestablish that structure except that it was occupied by a conforming use. So an example is in order. If I have a commercial business within a residential district, and that commercial business has the appearance, doesn't look like a house, it looks like a commercial business, it looks like an office. It's a very modern professional office. It's non-conforming, and it's in the front setback just a little bit, and it's occupied, so it's structurally non-conforming, and it's occupied by an attorney. Its use is non-conforming as well, and it burns. Under the old ordinance, the only thing I could do was build back a house on that lot. That was it. The structure had been destroyed. The use had not been abandoned, but by the language of that ordinance, the only thing that I could put back there was a single-family house. After the recommendations, if they are adopted, endorsed, and so forth. If it's abandoned for a year, it still has to be conforming. If that office stays on the ground with no vested interest in rebuilding, meaning there's been no action that is discernible and recorded, and we can get into the technical jargon of what that means, but basically if that property owner has not given the city a fair indication that they wish to rebuild within a year, then they cannot rebuild that office. If they come back within a year and pull a building permit or purchase a business license, they vest themselves in that property within a year. They can reconstruct that same building. They just have to meet the dimensional requirements. In other words, what they build back has to meet the building setbacks for that residential zoning district.
Would they have to complete the building in that
No,
time?
they have to vest an interest in that time. Now, there are, of course, games that get played with things like that, but those games, and I say games, everybody understands what I'm saying, I think. Those games are of less impact than preserving the right of that developer to come back within a reasonable amount of time and use the property as they were using it previously. So let me explain that again. If I'm an attorney in a residential district, I have a non-conforming use, and my building sits within the front setbacks of that district. Say it's a 25-foot setback and I'm 10 feet off the road. Under the old ordinance, if my structure is lost, I cannot do anything except for rebuild a single-family residence, which is a conforming use, a permitted use, within that, at least 25 feet back, within that building setback. Under the new regulations, as we propose them to be, that same individual, if they lose their office, can reestablish that office with that use. They can reestablish an attorney's office within a year. But, and this is a very small sacrifice, they have to move that structure to a location on the lot that is as conforming as it can be. They have to meet that 25-foot setback. If they can't do that for some reason, they would be eligible for a variance. That would be a case in which an individual would be eligible for a variance if there was absolutely no way they could build a viable structure on a lot of the size that it was before without some sort of relaxing of the rules. So basically what we've done is we have allowed for non-conforming uses and structures to have a great deal of latitude. And we've done that after careful listening and after many conversations, because the basic premise that I think we need to talk around is that if that structure is destroyed, most likely rebuilding that structure is in the best interest of that neighborhood. Even if the lawyer was a bad neighbor. I don't know how many of them there are, but even if the attorney was a bad neighbor, and all the neighbors don't necessarily get along with that use, the right of that individual to be able to reestablish their business in a timely manner is important, and it should be something that's protected.
Nathan, let me ask you, if that went back as a different type business, as long as it was a business, that would be permitted?
As long as it was the same business.
So if a lawyer lost his business, you couldn't put a flower shop on it?
Correct.
It'd have to be a lawn?
Unless it was rezoned. That would
Okay.
be, that individual has a vested interest in that particular
You couldn't
business.
sell that lot to someone else and they put a different type of business there?
Correct. That individual has a vested interest in that type of business. You could sell it to another attorney. Or if it's a car wash, you can sell it to another person who wants to operate the car wash.
But the use
That
stays
has a
the
vested
same.
interest.
The use has to stay the same?
Yes, the use has to stay the same. Because that minimizes the long-term impact. And if somebody decides that they can't sell it as what it was before, then they can redevelop it into something that's conforming, or request that it be rezoned. But that's a significant change between the old ordinance and the new that is an attempt to accommodate a lot of what we've heard. And it's not a bad standard if your bottom line goal is to see neighborhoods improve in a timely manner. It's not a long-term strategy. It's not a 50-year strategy necessarily. In 50 years, you may still have an attorney's office there. But in 50 years, that attorney has been able to maintain his building, the roof's not falling in. It's the same structure that it was, but if he or she is still able to, they have been able to upkeep their building and have been able to keep it to a standard that is acceptable to the community. Or if they decide to tear it down and put the same use back on the structure, they put a new building on it that conforms with the setbacks, so the dimension requirements, the spacing and massing of buildings that planners often talk about have been preserved and promoted. Or if they decide to rebuild, convert it into a home, they can do that as well. So before I proceed off of this and talk about manufactured homes, I want to make sure that there are no questions about nonconformity. Okay. I am, again, going to hang out afterward. If you have a question individually, I'll be glad to try to address it. Before manufactured homes. They had to fall down around your ears was the complaint. And that was basically it. You couldn't pull an old one out and move a new one in. You couldn't improve on that property. You couldn't improve the neighborhood by investing in that lot. You just kind of had to wait for it to drag its way down and then put. Basically, the same standard we talked about applies. Before, you weren't able to remove one and bring it back in because it was classified as a structure. It was a non-conforming structure, so you couldn't tear down a non-conforming structure and be able to build another non-conforming structure. Well, the way we've redefined things is structurally, you only have to deal with your setbacks and your dimensional requirements, not whether it's a single-family home or whether it's a manufactured home. So after our recommendations, if they're approved, the owner can remove it and replace it with a compliant home, and they can upgrade and repair it. When I say compliant home, section 127 of the ordinance is something that we covered in the last meeting that we're in. It basically means that it's underpinned, it has appropriate porches, and that it is no less than 8 years old. Standard that was put in place a couple of years back to try to ensure that as much as we can when we're zoning, when we're regulating, because nothing's perfect, but to ensure that as much as we can, that as the wheel turns and one rolls out and another one rolls in, that it is an improvement over the one that was there previously. So by and large, if it's a 45-year-old home, an 8-year-old home is probably going to be somewhat of an improvement. Probably. No guarantee, but probably going to be a bit of an improvement. Before, you couldn't enlarge a building footprint or alter it. Afterward, you still can't enlarge the building footprint. You can't build onto the side of a manufactured home. You can't build onto the side of that doctor's office that I was talking about. But you can improve it. You can alter it. You can repair it. You can make repairs that aren't called for by health and safety codes. Because by the time it gets to a repair that's called for by health and safety code, it's really almost too late in a lot of cases to encourage property owner to invest in a newer, better facility, newer, better manufactured home, newer, better house. It's just a general principle that if I can't do anything but what I'm doing with it right now without starting completely over, I'm not going to do anything with it until I have to start completely over. I'm not going to reinvest. Doesn't make good business sense to reinvest in a parcel if I have to put a very high investment in it. No, I'm going to wait until I've gotten every bit of the useful value out of it, and then I'm going to reinvest again and get every bit of useful value out of it that I can. Well, under these regulations, if an owner ever decides that they want to get a higher value of it at any point in that chain, they can do so by improving that property and thereby improving the community, the neighborhood at large. So if I was to break down what we've tried to do in non-conforming, and just where I can, it's Monday, one syllable terms, as Ed said, make it better as quickly as possible, hold the value of these communities, hold the value of these neighborhoods, and try to bring it to the neighborhood scale. I think Mr. Tyler has a question.
If the owner removes,
It's perfect now.
if he removes his mobile home in a non-conforming place, does he have a time limit he's put that new mobile home back in there?
Excellent question. Yes, 1 year.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's got 1 year.
If you take one out of a, say it was the first example I put up of a neighborhood. There are two there. If those were taken out, they would have a year to re-establish themselves. And there's a lot of ways that we can tell when that starts and when it stops. Evidence of electric meter being turned on and things of that nature are a really good source of information. But yes, to answer your question directly, they also are subject to that same 1 year time requirement, which is a relatively lenient. And they have to provide some evidence that they intend to, if they bought a new home or they've got a building permit, they've got to build a sale for a new one and say we intend to move it in. Well, they've got a year from the point where they have that bill of sale in hand to get it in there. Then again, they lose it. So if I pull one out and then I go purchase one 4 months later, I'll have a year from that purchase to get it installed. If I pull one out and I purchase one 11 months later, I'll have a year from that purchase, 23 months total at that point to get it installed. So that's a pretty wide window for somebody who says, I intend to build. And the same would apply to a building permit if someone, say their single-family home is in a single-family home is in a commercial district and their home burns. They would be able to, within that year period, get a building permit to show that they intend to rebuild, and then they would be able to start construction on that project in that year. And then they have to make significant progress along the way. Further questions?
Who makes the decision whether it's significant progress or not?
Excuse me, I'm parched. The building inspector and the zoning compliance officer would have to determine along with the city attorney what was reasonable in a case like that.
So somebody would have to be monitoring
Sure.
that.
Yeah, somebody would have to be taking a look, making sure that they were making some kind of progress. Well, we are right at the 1 hour mark. I will be glad to answer any questions that might additionally be generated from the public.
One question on the removal of a manufactured home. If they wanted to remove it and put another one in, you said they had a year to compliance, to put another one back there.
Yes, sir.
Are they still under the rule that they have to keep that area groomed or manicured during that year of vacancy?
Yes, the city's nuisance ordinances that deal with things
They
like
can't let it
junk
grow
ordinance
up.
and litter and grass height, things of that nature are still in effect. As well, somebody moves one out, brings one in, during that year period, they still have to comply with what we mentioned earlier, the section 127 requirements, the 8-year underpinned and porches requirement.
But they have to be compliant during the waiting period where they're waiting to get that back in compliance as far as the home. They still have to keep that clean during that
Yeah,
interval.
whatever provisions or ordinances that are not zoning,
Yeah.
because these are not zoning ordinances, but whatever provisions or ordinances require that a property owner keep and maintain their property, those are of general effect. They're in effect all the time. Yes, ma'am.
If you've got a mobile home on your property and you're in the city limits and you decide to sell your property, then the mobile home wouldn't have to be sold to somebody out of the city limits.
No, if it's zoned for manufactured housing, then you can transfer it by right. In addition, if it is, are you speaking of the sale of the structure or the sale of the structure and the home?
Structure and home.
Okay, structure and home. If you have a parcel and it's got a manufactured home on it and you desire to sell it, pretty much you can sell it. You can transfer your vested interest in that nonconformity to another person if it's not in the right zoning district. Or if it is in the right zoning district, it's a AR1 or R1 district, then you can do that by right. So essentially, yes, if you have an existing non-conforming use, you can sell that non-conforming use. I didn't put a slide on here for complaints, but I'll hear those. This is the opportunity for those as well.
Mine's not a complaint. Question, the example you used earlier of the attorney in the non-conforming residential area, what is the standard, I guess, that will be used as far as the grandfathering? Grandfathering go back to the 2010 ordinance? Will grandfathering be a part of this new proposed 2013 ordinance, or how does that work?
The legal or the standard for nonconformity is that it was a legally established use prior to the passage of the zoning ordinance. So, the original ordinance in Hamilton was passed in 2009. Before then, anything that was legally established, which there was no zoning, but if it was legally established before then it received grandfathered or non-conforming status. If it was established legally under the 2009 ordinance up until any changes are made, then it is going to receive grandfathered status. If it was established outside of conformity with the 2009 ordinance, between 2009 and whenever this new ordinance, if it is passed, when it is passed, if it was established illegally at any point in time, then it does not receive nonconformity. It does not receive a grandfather status. So if I decided to build my attorney's office inside of a residential district at any time between 2009 and today, excuse me, in an existing residential district, then I have not established that use legally. So I do not, in that case, gain the grandfather status for that use. Now, the city could take action to remedy that if it was a controversial issue and there was need to. If I was the zoning compliance officer, I'd probably be very mean about it, because the job of the zoning compliance officer has been very difficult for the past few years, because there have been a lot of issues. But the law was passed, the zoning ordinance was passed, and it was the law up until it's changed. It continues to be the law, and it will be up until it's changed. And that's not to say I'd be really mean about it, but I would say it's not conforming. You have one main option, which is to request that it be rezoned.
Somebody started development for this you're talking about. They're going to be grandfathered in, right?
Depends on if they started the development prior to 2009, and then if after 2009 that development was conforming with the zoning ordinance. Again, unless the council decides that they want to take action to grant some lenience on it. But that's not as things are currently written. And I would, of course, caveat any of these sayings with, I'm not an attorney, and I would seek the advice of a municipal attorney in any questions related to legal precedent or issues.
Nathan, just tell us, if you have no more questions, 2 weeks from tonight, what we'll be doing, what will be on the agenda for us to look at.
If you came in early, you saw that we had our crayons out. We have a draft of the drafting markers, it sounds better. We have a draft of the ordinance that we intend to propose, the map that we intend to propose to the planning commission here. And you stop by and look at it, we'll be here for a while, we'll stop and chat about it. What we'd like to do is finalize the zoning map, the draft recommendation of the zoning map. Present that to the planning commission. There's two ways we can do that. We can be prepared to do that at our next public hearing, in which case we need to advertise that as a planning commission, have the chairman ensure that there's quorum here, conduct it as a regular planning commission meeting. Or we can present it as at a subsequent planning commission meeting. That's the technicality, legal precedent, and so forth. Once the planning commission is comfortable with the map and the text of the ordinance, then they can make a recommendation that that be adopted by the council. Once that has received adequate publication by the zoning enabling legislation and so forth, there'll be at least one public hearing. That's the minimum that's required by law. We've already had, will have had by that point 3. So hopefully everyone will have had an opportunity to hear what changes we're proposing, to give their ideas of what needs to be done, hear what changes we're proposing, take a look at various drafts, the way that we've gone about this, talk to us about it, talk to the planning commissions, your council people, and so forth. Come once more, at least once more, and have an opportunity to express themselves. Because that's, again, that's a requirement of our enabling legislation. And then finally, following that public hearing at a time and manner that is appropriate to the council, then the council will take up the ordinance and will vote whether to adopt it or not. And when I say the ordinance, I mean both the district boundaries that are established by the map, as well as the rules that are established in the text of the ordinance. We anticipate a timeline if we can adopt this, or if we can constitute the next workshop, which is, I did not put the date, 2 weeks from tonight on September 9th. Is that correct? September 9th? Turn my phone off. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe September 9th is our next workshop. And it'll be a brief one, if we've done our homework here.
September 9th.
Right,
We can have it as a planning commission meeting, we can have additional comments on the boundaries, we can have the ability to make changes to the map here at the meeting, and then hopefully what comes out of that is a recommendation from the planning commission to adopt the map and the ordinance. Of course, no rush, at their convenience, when they feel comfortable with making that recommendation. And then publication, public hearings, and an adoption by the council on a schedule and on the agenda that's comfortable also with the council and mayor. So those are really the next steps. We are in the final stages. We've heard a lot of comments. We've talked to a lot of people. We've answered a number of questions. And hopefully have, by the time we finish this at least, given enough advance notice of what we intend to do, enough reasoning and discussion of why we intend to do it, to have something that, again, may not make everyone happy, but that is a comfortable ordinance for those that are in positions and in authority ultimately to adopt zoning for the town, for the city.
Bill, what are you thinking, if you could have your group meeting that night?
I really don't think so. I think the planning commission needs to sit down as a group and look at this map and go over the written statements. So I think we need a special time to do that.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
I do. I agree. I mean, you hadn't had time to, some of the members hasn't been here, and I don't see how in 2 weeks they can be able to make a recommendation to us until they get together and see the map and see the ordinance.
Well,
It may take a little bit
by and
longer.
large, at your convenience,
Right.
able to come down and bring the maps with us. But prior to the next hearing 2 weeks from now, in just a couple of days actually, we will provide draft copies to the city.
Okay.
That the city will be able to make copies of and distribute. So,
Just so that I can, on my end, that would mean then that the dates for publication of that to the ordinance then would be later than, probably. If they decide later past that date, then I need to tell Les then that it'll probably be, we don't know exactly when, but it'll be some later Saturdays besides that.
yes, that would be correct.
If, just on our end, the soonest we could know that possibly that would be, so I guess it's gonna be a big thing on our end, so just let us know.
Well, thank you very much this evening for coming out once again. We do appreciate it. It is important for y'all to come and to ask your questions and let others. It's going to be 6 on the 9th at 6. But to let everybody, we appreciate especially those that ask questions so that everybody can hear. I know it's a little bit nerve-wracking sometimes to get up in front of a group of people, but I think everybody benefits from a group like this. You never have the same group of people in the same room again at the same location at the same point in time. So the ideas that you get out of it are important and they're unique, and they're critical to the work that we do as advisors, and even more important to the folks that serve on your planning commissions and are selected by the people to serve on your as mayor and council. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.